So if you ask an architect to design a modern skyscraper, there is a very rigid expectation of how that process works.
Right. Oh, absolutely. You need one mastermind, one comprehensive set of blueprints, and a clear linear timeline.
Right. You pour the foundation, frame the steel, and just follow the plan step by step until the building touches the sky.
Yeah, and it requires a completely unified vision. I mean, even a slight deviation in the measurements from one floor to the next,
Yeah.
and the whole structure basically becomes unstable.
Exactly. But imagine a skyscraper built over the course of 1,500 years.
Okay.
And imagine it was constructed by more than 40 different general contractors who never actually met each other.
That sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
Right. A few of them are kings, some are peasants. One is a commercial fisherman, another is a medical doctor. And they're building this structure on 3 different continents, speaking 3 totally different languages.
I mean, you would naturally expect just a chaotic, collapsing pile of rubble. Just a disastrous mix of styles that goes nowhere.
You get a historical Frankenstein's monster.
Exactly.
But instead, you step back, and the doors align, the plumbing flows perfectly from the 50th floor straight to the basement, and the entire structure points straight up.
Yeah.
Today, we are looking at an ancient document that was built using that exact, seemingly impossible method. We are jumping into a massive stack of historical data, manuscript records, and archaeological research based directly on Josh McDowell's exhaustive book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict.
Yeah, and the mission for this deep dive is to objectively unpack exactly how antiquity's most famous text, the Bible, was constructed.
Right.
We want to look closely at the mechanisms of how it was preserved
Yeah.
and see how it actually measures up against the strict, unforgiving standards of modern historical and archaeological research.
And I want to set the parameters for this conversation right out of the gate for you listening. Whether you are walking into this as a hardened skeptic, maybe a lifelong believer, or just someone who loves the puzzle of ancient history, our goal today is not to take a religious side.
No, not at all.
We aren't here to endorse a specific theology. We are treating this as the ultimate historical detective story. So we're just going to impartially report on the factual claims, the historical comparisons, and the archaeological data presented in our source material.
Which really is the only intellectually honest way to treat any ancient document.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to strip away the cultural baggage and look purely at the physical evidence left behind in the dirt and the ink.
Well said. So let's start with the sheer scale of the text's composition. Going back to that skyscraper analogy, the physical construction of the Bible is staggering.
It really is.
The sources detail a writing process spanning 1,500 years. That is roughly 40 generations of human history. And the contributors, like I mentioned, they came from every conceivable walk of life.
Right. You have Moses, who was essentially a political leader trained in the elite universities of Egypt.
Yeah.
And then you have Peter, who's a blue-collar fisherman. Amos was a herdsman. Daniel was a prime minister in Babylon.
And the linguistic and geographical spread is just as broad. I mean, the text was composed across Asia, Africa, and Europe. It was written in 3 completely different languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Yeah. And if you've ever been part of a group project in college, you know that asking just 4 people in the exact same room to write a single cohesive essay usually ends in a disjointed mess.
Oh, 100%. It's impossible.
Right. So asking 40 people across a millennium and a half to write a unified narrative touching on highly controversial subjects.
Like morality and the origins of the universe.
Exactly. Logically, that should result in a totally fragmented anthology. But according to the literary analysis in our sources, this text maintains a singular, unfolding narrative arc from the first page to the last.
And what's fascinating here is that surviving that level of fragmentation and still maintaining thematic continuity, well, doesn't inherently prove the text is divine. But from a strictly literary standpoint, it unequivocally proves it is a unique artifact. There is simply no parallel in the history of human literature where a document is constructed over that much time by that many disconnected people without collapsing into a series of contradictory essays.
Yeah, and then you add in the bizarre historical ironies regarding its survival. This blew my mind. So, in the year 303 AD, the Roman Emperor Diocletian recognized the cultural power of this text, and he issued a massive edict to just destroy it.
Right, and it wasn't just a casual ban. It was a systematic, empire-wide purge ordering all Christian scriptures to be thrown into the fires.
He wanted it gone.
Diocletian understood that to eliminate a movement, you have to eliminate its foundational documents. It was an aggressive, state-sponsored attempt to erase the book from the historical record entirely.
But the ultimate twist of irony is that the very next Roman emperor, Constantine, ended up commissioning 50 copies of those exact same scriptures to be painstakingly reproduced at the government's expense.
The very empire that spent vast resources trying to burn the book ended up footing the bill to publish it.
Exactly. And that pattern of survival just repeats itself. Our sources highlight a really famous prediction by the French philosopher and skeptic Voltaire.
Oh, yeah, this is a classic.
He famously stated that within 100 years of his death, the Bible and Christianity would be swept from existence, relegated entirely to the dustbin of history.
He was very confident about that.
Very confident. Yet 50 years after Voltaire died, the Geneva Bible Society was actively using Voltaire's own house and his own printing press to mass-produce stacks of Bibles.
The historical irony is it's almost too on the nose.
It really is. But surviving the fires of emperors and the predictions of philosophers is one thing. If I am looking at this through the lens of strict historiography, saving a book from a fire doesn't mean you saved the original words.
Right. Because if people are copying a document by hand for over 1,000 years, the assumption is that the text is going to morph and evolve and distort.
Yeah, exactly. Which leads us to a foundational concept in history called the bibliographical test.
Yeah, and this test isn't concerned with whether the events described in a text actually happened. It is strictly about examining the transmission of the words themselves.
It's actual ink on the page.
Right. Since historians do not possess the original physical pieces of papyrus written by the authors, which we call the autographs, we have to determine how reliable the surviving copies actually are.
And this is where the comparative numbers become genuinely shocking. Our source material contrasts the New Testament with widely accepted classical literature. So take Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, right?
Okay.
Written around 50 BC, considered an absolute bedrock text for understanding ancient European history. We only have about 10 good manuscript copies of it.
10. Wow.
10. And the earliest copy we have was written 900 years after Caesar actually lived.
And yet historians generally consider 10 copies with a 900-year gap to be a highly reliable transmission for the ancient world.
Exactly. Then you look at the runner-up to the New Testament, which is Homer's Iliad. It has 643 surviving manuscripts, with a 500-year gap between when Homer composed it and our earliest physical copy.
Which is, finding over 600 ancient copies of a text is considered an absolute treasure trove in archaeology. It provides a massive data set for classical scholars to work with.
But prepare yourself for the New Testament numbers. The New Testament boasts over 24,000 manuscript copies.
24,000?
Yeah, that includes over 5,300 in the original Greek. There are 10,000 copies of the Latin Vulgate, which was essentially the everyday Latin translation used by the common citizens of the Roman Empire.
Right.
And there are another 9,300 copies in other ancient regional languages like Syriac and Coptic.
And the time gap shrinks dramatically as well. Instead of the typical 1,000-year blind spot we see with classical authors, the New Testament has fragments dating back incredibly close to the original events. How? Well, the John Rylands Papyrus, which is a fragment of the Gospel of John, dates to about 130 AD. The Bodmer Papyrus dates between 150 and 200 AD. We're looking at a gap reduced from a millennium down to mere decades.
Okay, but I have to put on my skeptic's hat here and push back on the sheer volume of that data.
Sure, go for it.
If you have 24,000 copies being made by thousands of different people across different continents over several centuries, doesn't that massive volume actually increase the probability of compounding errors?
Well,
I mean, it sounds like a catastrophic historical game of telephone. You whisper a complex theological concept to a scribe in Egypt. He writes it down, passes it to Rome. Someone there translates it poorly. And by the time you reach the 24,000th copy, the original message is just completely unrecognizable.
Yeah, the telephone game is the most common intuitive objection, but it completely misrepresents how the science of textual criticism actually works.
Yes.
Well, the game of telephone relies on a single linear chain of communication, where the original message is instantly destroyed once it is whispered.
Right.
If one person misspeaks, the error is permanent.
Oh, I see.
But manuscript transmission operates more like a branching family tree.
Wait, how does building a family tree solve the error problem?
Okay, so if a scribe in Alexandria makes a copying mistake in the year 200 AD, that specific mistake only gets passed down his specific branch of copies in Egypt.
Ah, okay.
Meanwhile, the scribes in Syria and the scribes in Rome are copying from completely different older branches. When modern scholars lay all 24,000 manuscripts on a table, they don't just read them linearly.
They compared the branches.
Exactly. They compare the Egyptian branch with the Syrian branch and the Roman branch. Because the lines of transmission are independent, a localized error stands out immediately.
Oh, wow.
You can literally trace the linguistic mutation backward up the tree and isolate exactly when and where the mistake was introduced. In textual criticism, an abundance of manuscripts is an embarrassment of riches. The more copies you have from wildly different regions, the easier it is to cross-reference and reconstruct the original text.
Okay, so the volume actually acts as a self-correcting mechanism. That totally explains the statistics on textual purity mentioned in our source. The scholar F.J.A. Hort calculated that the New Testament text is 98.33% pure.
Yeah, that's an incredibly high percentage.
It is. Now, critics will frequently point out that there are roughly 200,000 variants or errors across those manuscripts,
Right.
which sounds devastating until the source explains what a variant actually is. If a scribe accidentally spells the name John with one N instead of two, and that specific misspelling is copied into 3,000 subsequent manuscripts down his branch, historians count that as 3,000 individual variants.
Exactly. The vast majority of those 200,000 variants are just minor slips of the pen, spelling variations, or occasionally a scribe adding an extra conjunction like the word and. Sir Frederick Kenyon, who was the former director of the British Museum, he concluded after a lifetime of study that no fundamental doctrine of the Christian faith rests on a disputed reading. The core narrative remains completely untouched by scribal variations.
And there's also a fascinating secondary failsafe built into this history that I loved reading about. Let's say Diocletian had succeeded.
Okay.
Imagine a scenario where the Romans somehow managed to burn all 24,000 manuscripts. Every single Greek, Latin, and Syriac copy goes up in smoke.
Go on.
We still wouldn't lose the text. Our sources point out that early church leaders, men like Ignatius, Polycarp, and Clement, writing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, they were constantly quoting the New Testament in their personal letters and commentaries.
Yes, scholars have systematically sifted through the surviving correspondence of those early church fathers and cataloged over 36,000 direct quotes from the New Testament.
36,000. The research shows that you could reconstruct the entire New Testament minus a mere 11 verses solely by stitching together the quotes found in their personal mail.
That's just incredible.
It is. So the New Testament clearly passes the bibliographical test with flying colors. The sheer density of the family tree makes it the most well-attested document of antiquity.
Absolutely.
But that density only exists because Christianity spread incredibly fast across different cultures. Judaism, on the other hand, was much more localized for centuries. Does that mean the much older Hebrew texts, the Old Testament, suffered a worse fate when it comes to transmission?
Well, for a long time, historians genuinely thought so. The Old Testament was completed around 400 BC. But until the mid-20th century, the absolute oldest complete Hebrew manuscript that scholars possessed was called the Masoretic text, which only dated back to about 900 AD.
That is a 1,300-year blind spot.
Yeah.
If I put myself in the shoes of a 19th century historian, I would absolutely assume the text had evolved. 1,300 years of hand copying in a localized region feels like more than enough time for myth and legend to creep in or for scribes to aggressively alter the theology.
And that was the prevailing academic theory. A major branch of 19th century study, known as higher criticism, operated on the exact assumption that the Hebrew text had been heavily altered during that dark period.
Right.
But that assumption misunderstood a critical cultural factor: the mindset of the Jewish scribes, specifically groups like the Talmudists and later the Masoretes.
Yeah, we tend to think of ancient copying as, just a guy in a dim room jotting down what he reads.
Right, very casual.
But the source material details how the Talmudists turned transcription into a terrifyingly rigid mathematical science. They could only write on the skins of specific clean animals. The ink had to be a specific black recipe. They had to ceremonially wipe their pens before writing the name of God.
Wow.
And most importantly, they literally counted every single letter and syllable in a book.
They mapped the text mathematically. They knew exactly which letter was supposed to be the dead center of a scroll. If they finished copying a book and the middle letter was off by even one position, the entire manuscript was deemed invalid.
It makes me think of a high-end currency printing press. Like if you're printing $100 bills and a single dot of ink is out of place on one bill, you don't just use it anyway.
No, you definitely don't.
You throw the entire sheet into the incinerator because a flaw compromises the integrity of the currency. The scribes operated with that exact level of stakes. To them, physical perfection was the only guarantee of textual perfection.
And that's why, when a manuscript simply got old, or started showing wear from being rolled and unrolled, they would reverently bury it or destroy it to prevent any faded letters from ever being misread.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, they systematically destroyed the ancient originals to protect the purity of the copies. They preferred a mathematically flawless new scroll over a fragile, deteriorating original.
Which perfectly explains why the oldest copy historians had was from 900 AD. But even knowing their strict rules, modern critics still demanded proof. Without an older document to cross-reference, how could anyone mathematically prove the 900 AD text matched what was written 1,000 years earlier?
Well, the proof finally surfaced in 1947, under incredibly accidental circumstances.
This is my favorite part. A Bedouin shepherd boy was out looking for a lost goat among the limestone cliffs near the Dead Sea.
Right.
He tossed a rock into a dark cave opening, hoping to scare the goat out. But instead of an animal, he heard the distinct sound of shattering pottery. He climbed inside and stumbled onto what is widely considered the greatest manuscript discovery of modern times, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, inside these caves were sealed clay jars, and inside the jars were leather scrolls that had been perfectly preserved by the incredibly dry desert air for 2 millennia.
And when scholars arrived, they found a complete, unbroken copy of the Book of Isaiah. Experts in paleography, which is the science of dating ancient documents by analyzing handwriting styles, ink composition, and material decay, they dated this specific scroll of Isaiah to 125 BC.
Just like that, the 1,300-year blind spot vanished. Scholars had a scroll that was a full 1,000 years older than the 900 AD Masoretic text. It provided the ultimate test for the Jewish scribal tradition. They laid the 125 BC scroll side by side with the 900 AD version.
And after a millennium of hand copying, the results absolutely stunned the academic world. They were 95% identical, word for word.
95%?
Yeah. And when scholars analyzed the 5% difference, it wasn't missing chapters or altered theology. It was entirely obvious slips of the pen and minor spelling variations. Things like adding a conjunction or the way a specific word was spelled changing over 1,000 years.
The actual meaning of the text was completely unchanged. The obsessive mathematical precision of the currency press method actually worked. They had successfully frozen the text in time.
It's incredible.
The Dead Sea Scrolls effectively silenced a century of skepticism regarding the transmission of the Old Testament.
Okay, but here's the thing. The internal textual purity is fascinating, but it only proves one thing, that they copied the story accurately. I can hand copy The Lord of the Rings 1,000,000 times with 100% mathematical precision. That doesn't mean Middle-earth is a real place.
Right, exactly.
If we are evaluating this as history, the internal words must be validated by the external dirt.
Yeah, we had to shift from textual criticism to archaeology. Do the people, the political borders, and the cities mentioned in the text actually match the ground?
This source quotes Nelson Gluck, who was one of the most renowned and respected archaeologists of the 20th century. He stated on the record, "No archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference."
Which is a staggering claim, given how aggressively the text has been scrutinized by historians.
Seriously.
The Ebla tablets provide a perfect case study for how archaeology has routinely forced critics to update their assumptions.
Walk us through that one.
Well, for a long time, critics claimed that Moses could not possibly have written the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, around 1400 BC. The dominant assumption in academia was that complex writing, and specifically sophisticated legal codes, didn't exist in that region during that era.
They assumed society was too primitive.
Right, meaning the detailed laws attributed to Moses had to be anachronistic. They must have been written centuries later by someone else.
But then archaeologists began excavating a site in northern Syria and uncovered the ancient kingdom of Ebla, dating back to 2300 BC. They found a royal archive containing 17,000 clay tablets.
Wow.
And when linguists cracked the cuneiform writing on those tablets, they found highly advanced judicial proceedings, complex case laws, and detailed societal regulations.
The dirt proved that 1,000 years before Moses was even born, highly advanced legal and writing systems were already flourishing in the exact geographical region he lived in. The historical setting of the text was completely vindicated.
And you see similar validations with specific physical geography. The excavation of Jericho is a fascinating anomaly.
Oh, this is a great one.
Right. In ancient siege warfare, when an invading army breached a walled city, the walls would naturally fall inward as they were pushed down, or the attackers would just break a hole and climb over the rubble.
But when archaeologists finally dug down to the foundation of Jericho, they found that the walls had fallen outward.
Which makes zero sense in conventional ancient warfare. But it perfectly aligns with the biblical narrative, which specifically describes the walls falling down flat outward, allowing the attackers to just walk straight ahead into the city.
And the broader details of the ancient political landscape also hold up under extreme scrutiny. The story of Sir William Ramsay in our sources is particularly telling here.
Ramsay was an absolute giant in the field of historical geography, but he was fully convinced by the German historical schools of his time that the New Testament book of Acts was a complete fabrication.
Right.
He believed it was a piece of propaganda written in the mid-2nd century by someone who had no idea what the first century world actually looked like. He spent years conducting topographical studies in Asia Minor with the express purpose of using archaeology to prove the book was historically inaccurate.
He literally went into the dirt to bury the text.
But the dirt refused to cooperate. Every time Ramsay dug, he found that the author of Acts, a physician named Luke, was terrifyingly accurate. For example, Luke mentions a city treasurer in Corinth named Erastus.
Okay.
For centuries, critics laughed because there was zero Roman record of an official named Erastus in Corinth. Then, in 1929, archaeologists were clearing debris in Corinth and unearthed a large stone pavement inscribed with the words, "Erastus, curator of public buildings, laid this pavement at his own expense."
Boom, right there in the stone. Ramsay also looked at geographical borders, right? Luke stated that the cities of Lystra and Derbe were in the district of Lycaonia, but that the neighboring city of Iconium was not.
Yeah, and Roman writers like Cicero had claimed Iconium was in Lycaonia, so historians assumed Luke just made a geographical blunder.
But Ramsay eventually found a stone monument proving that Iconium was actually a Phrygian city, exactly as Luke implied.
Luke even used a very strange, highly specific Greek word, politarchs, to describe the civil authorities in the city of Thessalonica. Because that word did not exist in any known classical Greek literature, the scholars accused Luke of just inventing a title.
They thought he made it up.
Completely made it up. But decades later, archaeologists uncovered 19 different inscriptions using the exact title politarch, and 5 of them were found directly in the ruins of Thessalonica. It was a highly localized political title.
Wow.
Ramsay was so overwhelmed by the sheer, stubborn precision of these details that he completely reversed his academic position, concluding that Luke was a historian of the first rank.
When you synthesize all of this, the geography, the political titles, the cultural anomalies, it paints a very specific picture of the author's methodology.
Because if I am trying to invent a myth to start a new religion, the absolute last thing I would do is anchor my fake story to highly specific, easily verifiable local political titles, public figures, and precise geographical boundaries. If you invent a myth, you said it once upon a time in a vague, distant land.
Right, you said it in a galaxy far, far away where no one can check your facts.
Exactly.
But the biblical authors wrote firmly within the space-time dimension of their immediate audience. They named the local governors, the street names, the exact types of magistrates. In the ancient world, writing that way was essentially daring the local authorities and skeptics to walk down the street and contradict you.
You only include that level of verifiable detail if you are confident in your eyewitness testimony.
They were leaving extremely specific breadcrumbs for historians to dig up thousands of years later.
Yeah. And when we look back at the scope of this deep dive, the journey is just remarkable. We started by examining the unique, cross-continental, multi-generational construction of the text. We dug into the science of textual criticism, seeing how 24,000 manuscript copies act as a branching family tree.
Right, allowing scholars to identify errors and reconstruct the New Testament with incredible purity.
We explored the terrifyingly precise mathematical copying methods of the Jewish scribes and saw how paleography and the Dead Sea Scrolls vindicated a 1,300-year blind spot.
And finally, we looked at how the physical dirt of history, the Ebla tablets, outward falling walls, and Roman pavements forced brilliant, highly motivated skeptics to rethink their entire assumptions about the historical accuracy of these ancient authors.
I think the takeaway for anyone exploring this data is that engaging with this text does not require intellectual suicide. It doesn't demand closing your eyes and taking a blind leap into the dark. The source material presents an argument for an intelligent faith, asking you to evaluate this document using the exact same unforgiving rules of evidence, probability, and historiography that we apply to any other piece of ancient literature.
The standard of historical proof remains consistent across the board.
And I want to leave you with a final lingering question to ponder as you walk away from this data. If we take the incredibly strict bibliographical and archaeological tests that have been aimed at the Bible for centuries, and we suddenly turn those exact same tests onto the rest of ancient literature, how much of our commonly accepted secular history actually rests on far shakier ground?
That's a great question.
If we completely trust our historical knowledge of Julius Caesar or Plato, based on just a tiny handful of copies written 1,000 years after they lived, what does that mean for how we should historically view a text with tens of thousands of copies dating within decades of the events?
It dramatically shifts the baseline for what we consider historically reliable.
It goes back to that impossible skyscraper. You can debate who the architect was, and you can certainly debate the ultimate purpose of the building. But when you examine the foundation, measure the materials, and see how the structure has withstood the weather of thousands of years, you can't deny that the building is standing right there in front of you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.